I'm going to tell you a story today. It's a story of defeat, submission, a story of betrayal and enslavement, and a story of victory and triumph. They called themselves the Lenape, common people. They were in a federation of Algonquin-speaking native peoples who lived in the area they called Lenape-Delaware. That stretched anywhere from the Delaware River to the Hudson River, down to the Delaware Bay, into Maryland, and also into parts of Connecticut. Among the Sachems, which is their word for chief, in 1720, living here in this area, there was one named Menangi, otherwise known as the left-handed. He was the Sachem of the Sankekan community of villages. Again, they weren't one solid tribe, they were a community of separate villages, a confederation of separate villages. The Sankekans lived along the river right here. As you drove up here, you undoubtedly traveled along the road called Sankekan Drive, which is Route 29. So Menangi governed those people. 8 miles to the south, you find the Otsayankis, who were settled along the Assunpink Trail, Shabakam Creek, and what is now Trenton. The first Europeans described the Lenape as tall, managing up to 6 feet, and explorer Captain John Smith, yeah, that Captain John Smith, he described them as giants. Of course, he was only 5'6", so that might have had something to say there. The population of the Lenape at the time ranged in New Jersey about 3,000 to 5,000 people. And in the other Lenape in the other area, you could go right up to 20,000 population. They lived in areas around here called Shackamaxon, which became Greater Philadelphia, Passyunk, South Philadelphia, Nanticoke, which was Maryland, and others. The Delaware Lenape were farmers primarily. They tilled the land, they fished, they hunted, but they were a very quiet people, not very warlike, not very organized. They enjoyed taking a low approach to life and enjoying it. They were peaceful, non-militant, and they enjoyed the relationships with the other Algonquins in the area. On the other hand, there were some neighbors who were not so friendly. And we'll point out to one such tribe as the Susquehannocks people who lived along the Susquehannock River in central Pennsylvania. They were known by the Lenape as Minquas, and they were related to the Iroquois Federation. We'll deal more with that then later. The coming of the beaver trade, believe it or not, this had a tremendous influence over the Native American population in North America. When the French established their residency in 1603 along the St. Lawrence River, they met the northern Algonquin Indian tribes, who gave them many furs. Among them were beaver. Well, the French sent the beaver back to Europe, and guess what? They became very popular for making hats. And the hats became all the rage in Europe. Believe it or not, over 1 million beaver were sacrificed to make hats. And in the hunting and trading and trapping of those beaver, many hundreds of thousands of lives were lost just for hats. The Dutch traders established a trading post on the island of Manatas. You might remember that or might sound familiar to you. And they began sending some 80,000 pelts of beaver to Holland. That's a year. 80,000 pelts a year. Tremendous, tremendous business. It was in almost every country of Greater Europe. Now, the Northern Algonquins, they had a monopoly on this with the French. With the coming of the Dutch, well, the Iroquois wanted to get in on the action because it was a big action. And they were also against the Algonquins. They were enemies of the Algonquins. Now, these are the tribes of northern Canada. In 1570, the Iroquois confederated into 5 different tribes or states. And they decided, they embarked on a route of conquest. They were going to conquer all the other tribes who were dealing business with beaver. These were the Northern Algonquins, Abenakis, Hurons, Eries, Ottawas, and Miamis. We're going to be talking an awful lot about the Native American populations in this talk. So we're going to be coming across some strange names. As prospect for the trade with the Dutch increased, the Iroquois, they looked with jealousy at the Lenape. Why? Because the Lenape had settled all the land, all the river fronts, all the tributaries, all along the coasts, everywhere that the Dutch were beginning to settle and set up trading posts. The Iroquois were being left out. That was not a good thing. Not a good thing if you were an Iroquois. So they decided they were going to eliminate the Lenape. And they began on a series of attacks using the Oneidas, which was one of the tribes of the Iroquois, and the Senecas, which was another, and using their allies, the Susquehannocks. They attacked the Lenape from the north, they attacked the Lenape from the west, and they attacked the Lenape from the south. And the peaceful Lenape-Delaware, they didn't have much choice. They couldn't resist this very much. The Minquas sent out raiding parties against the Lenape, Shawnee, and Cherokees, who were neighbors of the Lenape. And what they would do is they would attack a village and leave a signature war club. That was to tell the people, hey, we're the ones who did this to you, so you better be afraid of us. But it also was a perfect way of framing another tribe for acts that were done by others. So the Susquehannocks would raid other parties, the Shawnee, the Cherokee. They would leave a Lenape war club at the scene, and then those tribes would then come and attack the Lenape. So they were getting attacked by all different sides. And again, remember, they're not a warlike people. Once upon a time, they might have been, but not now. Not in the early 1600s. We have a quote from one of the early historians. The Lenape were nearly annihilated from a nation numbering some 20,000 warriors occupying the territory between the Hudson and Delaware. They were now reduced to about 2,000, who were scattered in small bands all over the state. Now, with the advent of the Dutch, remember the Iroquois, they want to get in on the beaver trade. And their main source is going to be with the Dutch. And the Dutch were, shall we say, very opportunistic. They were going to take advantage of any opportunities that the Iroquois might present. And the first historian of New Jersey, one Samuel Smith, he was the grandson of the founder of Burlington, New Jersey, in the 1670s. He said that the Lenape-Delaware were easy prey for the combined attacks of the Iroquois. Things came to a drastic head in the fall of 1617. 1617, the Dutch called a treaty. They called a conference between the sachems of the Iroquois, the sachems of the Susquehannocks, and the subsachems of various Lenape villages. This was held at a place called Norman's Kill, which was a trading post. It was later to become Fort Orange, which would later become Albany, New York. Norman's Kill is just a little bit south of Albany. This meeting around the council fire would change the lives of the Delaware forever. I mean, forever. For the Dutch, it was unconditional trade for beavers and furs to send back to Holland. In return, the Dutch militia would aid the Iroquois and the Susquehannocks in all their wars against other tribes. That included providing muskets, ammunition, gunpowder. The Iroquois League stated, we're going to agree to this. As we conquered the Delawares by force of arms, the Iroquois have said, they now enslaved them. Samuel Smith goes on, they made them subject people in the Lenape land as of this treaty, 1617. The land granted to them by their grandfathers was no longer theirs. No longer theirs. And the very right to live on that land would only be guaranteed by paying annual tribute to the Iroquois League. They were forbidden to wage war on anyone. They were forbidden the use of weapons except for hunting and fishing. And they were expressly forbidden to have any muskets, powder, and ball from the Dutch. Absolutely not. And now we have also an original biographer of the Lenape. He's the Reverend John Heckwelder, who was a Moravian missionary. He lived with the Lenape from 1770 through 1790. He wrote his memoirs in 1816. And he knew the Lenape intimately. He tells us in the Lenape's own words, it was the Dutch who summoned the Great Council near Albany. Again, laying it on the Dutch, they're the bad guys. Normans killed 1617. The peace belt was laid across the shoulders of the Delaware, supported at one end by the Five Nations, and the other by the Dutch. The Iroquois say that they conquered the Delaware in battle and compelled them by force to become women and to wear petticoats. This is mentioned frequently all through the early histories of the Lenape. They were put subject to the greatest humiliation which a spirited people could ever be endured, as a permanent disgrace, which would last as long as their national existence. Well, it would last about 150 years, this disgrace. The additional threat on the part of the Dutch is that the Lenape got out of hand, and if they did violate any parts of the treaty, the Iroquois and the Dutch would gather together and they would exterminate the Lenape. Total extermination. That's the penalty for violating this treaty. The Five Nations of the Iroquois were extremely powerful, and again, warlike and growing stronger by the day, stronger by the month, stronger by the year. Since the parties traveled down the Susquehanna River from Binghamton and Syracuse to raid first the Susquehannocks and then the Lenape, it was a period of open warfare among the tribes. By 1722, the Five Nations had completely subjugated the Susquehannocks, nearly wiped them out, exacting tribute from them and from the Lenape as well. By 1722, the Tuscarora from Virginia, they moved north and joined the Iroquois League until they became the Six Nations. The Five Nations had completely destroyed the Susquehannocks, who had originally been over 2,000 warriors strong. Now they're ceased to exist as a tribe. Totally ceased to exist. Whatever broken remnants of the tribe were taken in by other tribes in refuge. So now the Iroquois said they have defeated and subjugated the Lenape in warfare, and they have made them women. The Lenape-Delaware right now, they've reached a national low. They were subjugated, they were humiliated, they've been disparaged, disrespected, and dispossessed by their enemies. Couldn't get much lower. Now we have the English come. 1644, the English took over and defeated the Dutch. They ousted the Dutch, and they settled all their own authorities, all their own governors, and all their own traders. And by the way, in 1664, they renegotiated the Treaty of Nordman's Kill. the infamous treaty that disempowered the Lenape-Delaware. This was now reinstated by the English. Almost immediately, the English started paying Lenape sachems to sell lands to the whites. The communities of Salem, 1676, Burlington, 1677, Stacy's Mills, which we now know as Trenton, 1678. By 1699, there were over 8,000 settlers in southwestern New Jersey, the majority of them Quaker women. In 1688, 10 Lenape sub-sachems sold 30,000 acres of land, encompassing all of Hunterdon County, to the English. Burlington would soon follow. The tract bordered the road to New York, Shabbaconk Creek, or Laocoon Creek. This purchase included today's Hopewell Township, most of the Amwells, and the southern part of Delaware Township. As more and more colonists bartered land from Lenape holders, the Lenape came to a drastic conclusion. During this time, the Lenape-Delaware were dispossessing themselves of their own land. But again, let me remind you, the land really wasn't theirs. It belonged to the Iroquois League. But they were dispossessing themselves of their right to live here, even after paying tribute. In 1682, the Lenape thought they had found a savior named William Penn. He was granted the entire western shore of the Delaware River. He had already settled on the eastern shore of the Delaware River. He came with the early settlers into Burlington, bought several hundred acres of property outside of Burlington. He negotiated the first New Jersey Constitution, which was emulated by other states or other colonies all throughout the 13 colonies. He was quite a guy. He envisioned having Pennsylvania and Western New Jersey as a Quaker Eden, a Quaker paradise. And yeah, it didn't work out that way. It didn't work out that way at all. 1683, he purchased land from between the Chamonix and Pennypack Creeks. This from Lenape sachems Matamakan and Tammany, and negotiated sales on other along the Chamonix Creek. And these included the heart of his future colony, Philadelphia, Chester, Marcus Hook, Wilmington, and Newcastle. Tradition has it that the great treaty of the Lenape taking place in the fall of 1682, or spring of 1683, we don't really know which, at Shakamaxon near Philadelphia, Sachem Temament was one of the spokesmen. Now, he wasn't the spokesman. Again, the Lenape didn't have a single sachem. They didn't have a single ruler. They had many community rulers. And Tammany was only one. And when he signed the treaty with William Penn, he was speaking only for his own village or group of villages. But the others, they kind of went along. When William Penn died of a stroke in England in 1718, he was broken and penniless, powerless, and responsibility for his affairs was assumed by his second wife, Hannah. The power and the proprietorships over Pennsylvania was now divided between Hannah's sons. Sons John, Thomas, and Richard. It was probably the worst thing that could ever happen to the Lenape. The Penn brothers and the Six Nations unite in an alliance. The Six Nations again dominated the area from the Council Land and Upper New York. And they were numbering at the time 15 to 16,000 people, some 1,000 warriors. Now, the Penn brothers established what is called the Pennsylvania Commission, the Pennsylvania Land Commission. And that would govern all barterings, all sales of property between the Lenape, the Iroquois, and the English. And again, the Iroquois had total ultimate approval over all this. And they even went so far, and this is the Iroquois League now, they had a real estate agent living in Philadelphia. who worked exclusively with pens and with the Pennsylvania commissioner named James Logan. It was this agent named Shikellamy who approved all land sales from the 1720s into the 1750s. Anything that was the Delaware or Lenape transacted to English, the Iroquois had to approve it. And it went through Shikellamy, and it went through the Penn brothers. And we go back to Reverend Heckwell. He tells us here, he tells us the story as it was told around the council fires over 300 years ago. And these are the words. Listen to the words of the Lenape. But it was not long before our joy was turned into sorrow. Our brother Minquan, William Penn, died, and strangers, land traders and speculators, William Penn's sons, they had taken their places and forgotten that friendship which your great man had established with us. They now only strove to get all of our land from us by fraud or by force, and sent word to our enemies, the 5 nations, to meet them at a great council. The Mengwe came, this is the Iroquois League. The council was held, and in the presence of the white men, the English, the Pennsylvanians, the Penn brothers, they told us that we were women, and that they, the 5 nations, had made us such. And we had no right to any of the land, because it was all theirs. It was all theirs. And that we, the Lenape, must be gone. How do you deal with that? Homeless. Totally homeless and powerless. But the Iroquois, being the generous people that they are, or that they were, they said, don't worry, we'll give you new reservations. We'll give you a new land that you can occupy, and that will be yours. That will be yours forever. We're going to send you up the Susquehanna River to the land of the Susquehannock tribes. Well, they're not there anymore, hint, hint. They're not using it anymore because they're gone. So you can have their capital towns, you can have their home, and you can live there for as long as the sun shall shine. So the Lenape said, and that was a great favor that the 6 nations gave us. They permitted us to go and settle further into the country. This is the Lenape speaking, in their words of 300 years ago, at the place which they themselves pointed out at Wyoming Valley, in the land of the Minquas, the Susquehannocks. So now they can move, they can take over the vacant Susquehanna capitals, and they can occupy those capitals for as long as the sun shall shine. So said Shikellamy. So said the Iroquois Nation. So they moved north and west along the Schuylkill River and settled in a collection of villages called Tupelhocken. I don't know if my laser point will work. No, it's not. But Tupelhocken, you'll see, is on the top of the map here. And this was one of the first great town reservations that was held by the Lenape. Again, it was the former Susquehanna capital, and they congregated here, maybe about 200 to 300 families started congregating here. Other families started congregating in the southern portion, which we now know is southern Philadelphia, along the Brandywine Creek. Now, this was another group of Lenape who were from the southern New Jersey area and also from Maryland. And they really didn't have a lot to do with the tribes of Tupelhocken, but they were still Lenape and they were refugees. Like everyone else of the Lenape Nation, they were refugees. And then you had the third great town, which became one of the strongest towns and the one that lasted the longest. It was called the Forks. We know it today as Eastern Pennsylvania, at the forks of the Lehigh River and the Delaware. And one of the most famous sub-sachems of the Forks was named Nutimus. We'll deal with him a little bit later. Now, the Penn brothers and the Pennsylvania Commission, they had always been used to dealing with somebody who's at the top and disseminates all the orders down the line. They figured we have to have someone in command, but we really don't want them to be in command. We want to have someone in command who we can control, who can dominate, and someone that the Lenape would respect. Well, they picked Sassoon. Sassoon was of the village of the town of Tupelhocken. He had royal blood. He was from the Turtle tribe. But he didn't have any power except over the villages in Tupelhocken. But that didn't bother the Penn Commission. That didn't bother the Penn brothers, because any orders that they issued through Sassoon would be enforced by the Iroquois. So, everything's easy here. And Sassoon was easily controlled. He was weak-willed. He was ineffective. And I didn't say before, but the English, in most of their trade relationships with the Lenape, they included barrels of rum. And basically, Sassoon was he was subject to some of rum. He liked his rum, and it affected a lot of his judgment, and it affected his efficiency as a leader. He was a complete disaster. He was supported by the Penns, but as long as the Iroquois League supported him and enforced his orders, everything was good. Okay, the second town, the Brandywine towns, they really didn't follow Sassoon at all, but they were doing their own thing, and as long as the Iroquois let them alone, they continued to do so. And we already talked about the forks, but I want to say one thing. In creating a position of a grand sachem, which is what the Penn Commission did, they established a precedent. And this precedent was that they were establishing the role of an ultimate leader of the Lenape tribe, of a united Lenape tribe. Well, they're not united just yet, but they established the fact that we support a leader and we support a grand sachem. And that was going to come back to haunt them. As long as they had Sassoon, who was easily controlled and weak-willed, everything was cool. But soon, within the next generation, a new leader would come aboard who would be not easily controlled, not easily led, and he would become the next grand sachem of the Lenape. Now, you've all heard of the Walking Purchase Treaty. It's been mentioned in almost every story or in every narration of the Lenape saga. You can hear it you can see it at the State House Museum. You can see it in multiple lectures of multiple speakers. And in 1737, it was one of the biggest ripoffs, I should say. Starting in 1722, German settlers started moving into Pennsylvania. And they started moving into the Forks area of the Lehigh Valley and the Upper Delaware. They took the land without permission of the Pennsylvania Commission. They took the land without the possession of the Iroquois sachem Shikellamy. And they definitely did it without the permission of the Lenape. But they were there, and they proceeded to stay there. Sassoon protested. 1732, another sachem of the Forks area, Lapinawinze, in 1737, he protested. And what happened was the Penn brothers saw a big profit in this. They said, it's a lot more land that we can sell to English settlers, a lot more land that we can sell to German settlers, and anyone who wants to move in. And, the Lenape won't mind. They won't mind. So what they did is they forged a treaty. They made up a counterfeit treaty that they said it came from William Penn. And it said that we issued a new land area of going up 60 square miles. And it was the greatest land that could be done by someone walking in a day. Well, they found a very fast walk. And that person doubled and tripled the time that it took. They doubled and tripled the land that they took. And frankly, it was one of the biggest scams of the 1700s, of the early 1700s. So Nudimus and Lapinawinze, they agreed to the phony deed, but they said, this is phony. We're not going to move. You know, we've been tricked. This is a counterfeit deed. We don't think William Penn signed this, and we're not moving. They were disgusted, and they knew they had been tricked. But the Penns continued to sell land patents in the forks. They continued to sell land on eastern Pennsylvania. So they were potentially dispossessing the Lenape, who had been granted that land by the Iroquois. So the Penns continued to sell. By 1740, more than 100 white families had settled in the forks. Solved the problem. The Penn brothers, John, Richard, and Thomas, they got together with Shikellamy, good old Shikellamy. And they said, Lenape have got to move. We're selling this land, and Lenape have got to move. There's no two ways about it. So once again, they had to leave. Once again, some of the land that had been promised them forever is now for sale. So the Iroquois League and Shikellamy said, okay, tell you what we're going to do. We still got some Susquehanna capitals in western Pennsylvania. We'll let you move over to them. Just go up the Susquehanna River about another 100 miles, and you'll find the village of Paxton, which was a former Susquehanna capital. And a little bit further up there, you see a village of Shamokin, which was another Susquehanna capital. You can have those. You can settle there. We won't mind. We're not using the land right now. Again, remember, the Susquehannocks are gone. They've been wiped out. And again, the land will be yours for as long as the sun shall shine. And they said, the Lenape were a conquered people. They had no rights to the land, and they must go. So finally abandoning Tupahawken to the English, Sassoon and his people moved to Susquehanna. They moved to Paxton. They moved to Shamokin, which became one of the largest Lenape towns, especially in the 1740s, 1750s, and early 1760s. It became a capital. But well, the fraudulent walking purchase has been regarded as the deal breaker by just about everybody who, between the English and the Lenape. And that's all very well. It really was to some extent, but it wasn't the deal breaker. What the deal breaker was, they lost Tupahawken, they lost Brandywine, and they lost the forks. And it was the loss of all three of their capitals together that was the most devastating part. The Lenape were now helpless. They were frustrated, humiliated by the Pennsylvania Commission, by the Iroquois League, and once again, they had to relocate to a new capital, which was theirs for as long as the sun shall shine. Well, once again, it wouldn't last. By 1731, a group of Lenape broke off. 260 Shawnee and 300 Lenape families. They crossed the Allegheny Mountains and settled a western capital in the village called Kittanning, which was in the upper parts of the Susquehanna River, right at the beginning. This would later become a main capital, and while Shamokin remained the eastern capital, Kittanning would be the western capital. Now we have a new leader. Okay, remember the English had created a Grand Sachem, but the Grand Sachem was supposed to be that they had created was Joe. Now they come up, he's dead, and they select a new leader who's Sassoon's nephew, Shingas. He was known by the sobriquet of Shingas the Terrible, if that will give you any idea. He was just in his 20s, he's just a young kid, but he was a firebrand. And he had a lot of hate for the English, and he had a lot of reason to hate the English. And at the same time, while he was being elevated as Grand Sachem, in 1754, the Penn brothers met with the Pennsylvania Commission, and they bought the entire Six Nations, bought from the Six Nations, all the eastern Susquehanna Valley, including all of the Lenape lands in Wyoming Valley. This had been land that had been guaranteed to them. Again, once again, they've been betrayed. Once again, the promised land was gone. Again, 1755, English and German settlers arrived in the Wyoming Valley. More Delaware and Shawnees moved west to Kittanning and joined the Western League of Delaware. And then Shingas was declared Grand Sachem of all the Lenape. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. There's only so much degradation and humiliation that any prideful nation can accept. 1755, well, we all know what happened in 1755. The French started moving down into the Ohio Valley. They built a fort, and they were going to take over the Ohio area. The British said, okay, we'll send a Major General Braddock, Edward Braddock, to displace them and captured Fort Duquesne. Well, that was a disaster. Enough has been said about that. Too much has been said. But Braddock was killed. 900, over almost 1,000 of his men were killed. And there was a joint effort by 630 Ottawas, Hurons, and Chippewas, in addition to just 300 French Canadians. Shingas decided, okay, he aligned the Western Delawares with the French. Okay, the English haven't been doing me any good. They've abrogated all my treaties. They've disgraced us. I'll go with the French. I mean, these guys look like they're going to take over, and they're going to be good to us. So he signed a pact to deal with the French. Armed by the French at Fort Duquesne, they proceeded to terrorize all the settlers of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland. And guess where they started? They started with all the settlers who settled in their previous capitals, in the Forks, in Tupahatcon, and in Brandywine. They burned every one of those settlers' villages to the ground. They captured the people, they enslaved them. They did a lot worse to them too. And I need not go into that. The rest of the Susquehannas, Delawares, swept into the English settlements and even into New Jersey. Over 700 Ohio, Lenape, and Shawnee warriors descended on all the settlements of eastern Pennsylvania. At this time, the Lenape decided they were going to have a change of character and a change of identity. From this moment, the Lenape no longer acceded to the name of Lenape. From now on, they were Delaware, and it would be the Fighting Delaware. The Delaware would signal a new ferocious line for them, and they were going to get their revenge. They were going to get payback for 150 years, 150 years of humiliation, treachery, and betrayal. For no longer would they be women, now they would be masters. And they terrorized the frontier. By the end of 1755, the Pennsylvania and Ohio frontier was in flames. Got so bad, Pennsylvania declared war on the entire Delaware Nation. 1756, Governor Morris declared war. English soldiers attacked the Delaware villages of Kittening, the western Delaware. At the same time, Shingus's brother sent a message to the governor and said, okay, we'll accede to a treaty. We'll disarm and turn ourselves in. Shingus stepped down as Kittening Grand Sachem in favor of his brother, called Beaver. And the Pennsylvania Commission signed a treaty at Fort Pitt in 1759. But all is good, right? The Indians are quiet. The English are happy. They got a brand new treaty. Well, guess what? There's a new guy in town. His name was Pontiac. And the Delaware and Beaver, Shingus's brother, said, this is a great opportunity. Pontiac's going to take us, and we're going to oust the English once and for all from Pennsylvania and Ohio. So he came in and cited by the Delawares. He was in Ottawa, which was from northwestern Ohio. And he united the Huron, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Chippewa, and his own warriors in a vicious attack on open season on western Pennsylvania. They were going to attack Fort Detroit, Fort Niagara, Forts at Venango, Leboeuf, Prescott, and Sandusky were all taken and burned. The Delawares raided the settlements in Tuscarora and Cumberland valleys in northern Kentucky. Back on the Susquehanna, they swept through the Wyoming Valley. Again, they had been ousted by them, so it's payback for the settlers who took the land away from them. And this one was called the First Wyoming Massacre, Wyoming Valley Massacre. I lost people in that fight, by the way. British counterattack. They hired Colonel Henry Bouquet and 400 soldiers they were attacked at Bushy Run by the Delawares, combined Delawares, Mingos, Shawnee, but they turned the tables on the natives, and they defeated them with heavy losses. They relieved Fort Pitt. Another English expedition under Colonel Armstrong led an expedition to Big Island, where the Delaware had taken refuge. He burned the town, destroyed the corn, and other crops. Another expedition was done in 1764 with 1,500 veteran troops and 100 skilled Virginia Indian fighters. They attacked the Delaware, Shawnee, Mingos, and Mohicans, all in the various capitals between the Ohio River and Lake Erie. Simultaneously, another English group attacked the Wyandots, Ottawa, and Chippewas. Well, it was a little bit too much. It was too much. Outmanned, outgunned, the Delaware agreed in November 1764 to lay down their guns and surrender. And all the Ohio Delaware sachems agreed to the treaty. In the peace treaty of 1765, Sir William Johnson, who was the main Indian agent of the British at the time, negotiated with Grand Sachem Beaver, now age 55, and Sachem Netawatsis, who was newcomer, and said, okay, the treaty will guarantee peace. You will lay down your arms. Oh, and there will be peace between the English and the Delaware from now on. But there's one catch. There's one catch, William Johnson said. By the way, he was married to an Iroquois princess. The Delaware were once again, subservient to their former masters, the Iroquois Six Nations. Once again, they had forfeited all their land rights to the hateful Iroquois. Once again. Does it ever end? Does it ever end? Another treaty came up, the Treaty of Fort Sandwich. This sold all the Delaware land, including the villages that they had just agreed to in treaty. Susquehanna River, the Kittening River, the Delaware were now completely homeless. They were a people without a country. They were offered refuge now by the Wyandots, who were at the tip of Lake Erie, Lake Huron, excuse me, and into lower Michigan. So they were given refuge by them. They were living in the Tuscarora and Sandusky rivers. So once again, they found some refuge, and they were further away from the Iroquois, but it was still going to be a problem. Now we come to the American Revolution. We're celebrating the 250th here. All too briefly, the Delawares had exchanged their petticoats for war clothes and now saw the rise of a brand new generation of charismatic leadership who were going to exact vengeance on the English and Six Nations. Beaver had passed on as Grand Sachem, and he was replaced by a Sachem called Newcomer. When he passed on, they were replaced by probably one of the greatest and most powerful leaders of the Delaware Nation. He was called White Eyes. And he was a friend to the Americans. He was a friend of peace. He was really a great diplomat. And he was a good friend of our missionary, Reverend Heckwelder, as well. Okay. They had settled in the new capital at Coshocton, which is just outside of Columbus. And by the way, one of the suburbs of Columbus is named White Eyes Township. At this point, they were divided into two. Pro-American under White Eyes. He was sensible, he was wise, courageous, and he was a great leader. On the other side was a cousin who was pro-British. His name, which I can't pronounce, but we'll call him Captain Pike. And by the way, there's a Captain Pike Township outside of Columbus as well. Captain Pike of the Wolf tribe. Heckwelder says he was an artful and vicious man, his head full of all the wrongs which the Indians had suffered from the Americans. His soul panted for revenge. He was jealous of White Eyes. Pike was a great man, but White Eyes was the greatest of them all. In September 1778, White Eyes signed a treaty of alliance with Americans. Captain Pike and one of his other Sachems disagreed. Within a month, White Eyes was murdered. Captain Pike, as one might suspect, he turned the rest of the Delaware into the side of the British, and the Delaware Nation formally joined the British. George Washington finally decided he had enough of this. He had enough of the Iroquois Nation. He had enough of Delaware. He had enough of dealing with all these people. So he assigned General John Sullivan. We know Sullivan from the Battle of Trenton, who led a division of the Continental soldiers into Trenton. And he was one of Washington's most qualified generals. In the spring of 1779, he led a Continental army of over 4,000 soldiers against the Iroquois Nation. His orders were to lay waste all the settlements around, that the country be destroyed, completely destroyed. By the end of the expedition, General Sullivan reported, "I am persuaded there is not a single town left in the Five Nations." The Iroquois losses were horrific. They had over 4,500 casualties, over 5,000 refugees who escaped into Canada. And the power and influence of the Six Nations was broken forever, as was the brutal domination of the Iroquois, which they held over the Delawares. The Delawares were now free to become their own people. But the warfare hasn't stopped yet. We now come to a new Grand Sachem. He was the last great Delaware Sachem who conquered Hellas, is his name. And he was a warrior, basically a leader, the equivalent, they say, of George Washington. He was a Delaware George Washington. There's a lot that has been written about him. He allied with one of the other great leaders of the Ohio country called Blue Jacket, who led the Shawnee. They became very close friends. They became allies, and they supported each other through the rest of the frontier wars. These two men, after White Eye's death, pro-English Captain Pipe assumed control of the Delaware Council, and the council ruled Delawares were now British allies. Well, Buchancahalis went along with Captain Pipe. The Delawares, with the 1783 peace treaty, Britain ceded the Northwest Territory to America. This land was occupied by the Delaware, Munsees, Shawnees, Ottawas, Mingos, Kickapoo, Chippewa, and all other tribes, all hostile to the Americans. The native settlements were attacked again. Wagon trains, expeditions to put down the rebellion suffered crushing defeats by the combined forces of Buchancahalis and his Delaware, Blue Jacket, and Shawnees. In the 1780s, Buchancahalis joined a Shawnee Confederacy, leading several battles against the North and West Indian Wars. One of these was the Battle of the Wabash in 1791. Continentals, led by Arthur St. Clair, he lost over 600 troops, massacred in that battle. The Delaware described Buchancahalis as their own George Washington. He stood 5 feet 10 inches tall. He was immensely strong, and he was said to resemble the statesman Benjamin Franklin. Remember that if you're doing Indian history. Now, Buchancahalis was then led into the final battle of the frontier, the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. Congress sent a third expedition under Mad Anthony Ewing, the famous soldier of the Revolution, with a force of over 2,000 men. He gave the natives a crushing defeat at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, 1794. Native American forces numbering 1,500, comprised of Delawares led by Buchancahalis, Blue Jackets, Shawnees, and Miamis. They were forced to surrender. And Buchancahalis, now 75 years old, he was forced to sign the Treaty of Grenville in 1795. By this treaty, his band and other Delawares ceded Pennsylvania and Ohio to the United States. And once again, they had to move. Buchancahalis died in May 1805 at the age of 85, and his people moved ultimately across the Mississippi. The Treaty of Grenville gave the Delaware land in the Northwest Territory all the way to the Mississippi and beyond. It gave them something they had not had before, a sense of identity, and finally, a sense of peace. After the treaties of Grenville, the Delawares crossed the Mississippi. Some moved south into Texas, others west into Kansas, others north into Missouri and Nebraska. There were various reservations that were assigned to them, or they just allied with other tribes. In Texas, they allied with the Caddo tribe. And recognizing good talent when he saw it, Texas President Sam Houston said he enlisted a company of Delawares to protect the frontier from the Comanche, which were raiding the Texas frontier, who made a peace with the Comanche in 1844. Delaware scouts rode against the Apache. They joined with the Texas Rangers patrolling the western frontier. And Delaware scouts rode with General Crook against the Sioux after the Custer Massacre. In 1859, U.S. government forced the remaining Delaware to move from Texas to the Washita River in the vicinity of present Anadarko, Oklahoma. In the late 1760s, the main body of Delaware arrived in Oklahoma. But then we deal with this gentleman. This gentleman is a war hero of immense proportions, Black Beaver. And he was a Delaware. He was the preeminent Delaware. He was a trapper, interpreter. He worked for the American Fur Company under John Jacob Astor. He roamed the Rocky Mountains with such greats as Jim Bridger, Jed Smith, Hugh Glass, and Kit Carson. Black Beaver became the first inductee into the American Indian Hall of Fame. He was fluent in English, French, Spanish, and an additional 8 other American native languages, including sign language. He guided the Dodge Leavenworth expedition of 1834. He led a Mexican-American War in 1846 to 1848. He led a company of Delawares as a captain in the U.S. cavalry. He was the captain. Company of 200 Delawares rode with Captain John Fremont and Kit Carson in the 1848 conquest of California. It was described of him, Black Beaver was one of the few heroes who never sounded his own trumpet. No one that knows him ever questioned his courage. By 1860, Black Beaver was the wealthiest and most well-known Delaware in America. He settled in Anadarko. Again, he was inducted into the Anadarko Hall of Fame. After the Civil War, Black Beaver and his very good friend Jesse Chisholm got together and they forged the first Chisholm Trail, herding cattle to Abilene and Dodge City, Kansas. He was also credited with establishing the California Trail to Santa Fe and beyond. The Delaware were crucial to the exploration of the American frontier, not just here in the East, but all across the Midwestern frontier and the American West. Working as trappers, as mountain men, they were known for their fierce courage and loyalty. They served as army guides and scouts. It was the Delawares that forged the trails for the great cattle drives, blazed the paths across the Rocky Mountains, and stood at the forefront of the settlement of the American West. In the end, the Delawares recovered their birthright, once lost 400 years ago. They found a national identity. No longer women, no longer with petticoats. They were great, great warriors and leaders. For over 250 years, the Delawares had had a date with destiny and found a place in American history. Thank you.